It's an honor to be here. It's great to speak to everybody in Japan. My name's Chris. I am Aiki's manager. You can thank him for inviting me. And I work on the Power BI customer advisory team at Microsoft. But today, we're not going to be talking about Power BI at all. No Power BI. Why? Maybe 6 months ago, I was talking to the leader of the Toronto Excel user group, and she said, "Hey, Chris, you blog quite a lot about Excel. Why not do a presentation showing all of the latest BI functionality in Excel? Can you use Power BI? Can you do BI with Excel, but not Power BI?" And I thought, that is a really great idea for a presentation. So that's what I'm going to be talking about today. There are two questions that I want to answer. First of all, do you need to buy Power BI to do Excel? Can you just use Excel on its own? And secondly, what's new in Excel? There have been a lot of changes in Excel in the last couple of years, and some of those are really useful for BI. So what's changed in the last couple of years? Now, in order to make this presentation short enough to fit into an hour or 45 minutes today, I created some rules. I'm going to talk about Excel on the desktop, either on Windows or on the Mac. And I'm going to talk about Excel in the browser with Excel Online. I will assume you have a Microsoft 365 subscription. And even though we will not be talking about Power BI, I thought it's really important to have Power Automate for some scenarios. So I will talk about Power Automate. Power Automate is part of the Power Platform along with Power BI. But, some of what I will be talking about has been in Excel for a long time, maybe 20 years. Some of it is only new this year, but all of it I think is really cool. And even if it's old, there may be some things in Excel you've never seen before. So we want to do BI in Excel. The first thing you have to do is define what BI means, because BI means lots of different things to lots of different people. So what I will do in this presentation is look at various different types of business intelligence and see how well we can achieve them in Excel. First of all, let's start with the easiest, simplest form of BI, which is getting a table of data onto an Excel worksheet. This is something you can do really well in Excel using Power Query. And Power Query is now built in to Excel in the Windows and also Excel on the Mac as well. So what do I mean by a table of data? Let's go to a blank Excel workbook. And I also have running on my PC a SQL Server database. So let's pretend we want to get data from the SQL Server database into Power BI. So I'm going to go to Data, Get Data from Database from SQL Server. We have to wait for Power Query to wake up, which is always slower when we're doing a Teams presentation. Come on. Here we go. So I'll connect to my local SQL server. I'm going to connect to the VentureWorks DW27 sample database. Click OK. And I'm just going to connect to one table. the fact internet sales table. Click on transform data. Let's just select a couple of different columns. So I'll select this order date key column. We'll select sales order number and line number. Say sales amount and tax amount. Remove all the other columns. And let's just filter by one date. So we'll filter the data so we only see the sales orders for, this is a very old date, the 29th of December 2010. And we can load this, and I will load it to the existing worksheet in B5. And here we go. We have a table of data inside Excel. It's connected to a database, and if I refresh the query and the data is changed, the new data gets loaded into Excel. So this is the absolute simplest form of BI, just loading a table of data into an Excel workbook. Now, let's do something slightly more sophisticated. Let's say that we want to be able to select the date that is being chosen here, because returning a table of data is all very well, but in most, even the most simple BI scenarios, we need to be able to enter some parameters. So let's say that we want to enter a date, and I will use the same format that I've got here, and we will say 2010 12/30. And let's go get data from table range. I'm just going to create a table here. Click OK. And rather than return a table from my Power Query, what I want to do is to be able to drill down and just return the number that I wrote in that cell. The version of Excel that I'm using here is an early kind of internal build that Microsoft has given me. It has a bug in it. I would normally use a named range just to contain the date that I've entered, but today I have to create a table. Let's call this query selected date. Let's go back to the fact internet sales query we've got here. And here is the hard-coded filter on the 29th of December 2010. Let's change this. The filter on the number returned by the selected date query. And let's close and load. Actually, we don't even want the only create collection. Let's forget about that. But here we go. All right, so we can refresh this query. You can see it's already turning the data for the order date key, the 30th of December 2010. And if I change this to the 31st of December and refresh the query, there you go. I have entered the date. That date has been used as a parameter passed to the query that I'm going to run against the AdventureWorks DW database, and use that number, that date, to filter the order dates that are being returned. So this shows you how you can do a really simple parameterized table. This is a very basic demo. If we go over to here, you can see something a little bit more sophisticated. So for example, you could change the query so that you enter a date rather than a number. We refresh this. Actually, we could say 31st and refresh this. This needs to wake up. This is a different Excel workbook. Come on. It's always slow the first time you run it, especially, like I said, with Teams. There we go. So I can enter a date rather than that horrible number format. And I can also make things even more sophisticated. So for example, instead of having to enter my parameter values in a box, I can have a drop-down list of all of the parameters that I want to use. So here we go. There is a nice drop-down list. So I can choose the name of the product that I want to select. I can also use slices to control the date. So rather than having to enter the date manually, I can use slices. So let's choose January 2011. And probably the worst thing in that basic demo was the fact I had to go to the queries window and right-click on the query to refresh it. Here, I can just run the report. There we go. Everything updates. How have I done this? Well, this drop-down list is actually a very new feature in Excel on Windows Desktop. It's data validation, which is a feature that's been around in Excel for a long time. But now with data validation, if I start typing, you can see the data validation drop-down list changes. This is something that's brand new. These slices are something a little bit more complicated. How have I done this? Well, what I have is a hidden table on this worksheet, which contains all of my dates. And I've used slices to control which rows are filtered on there. So if we go back to here and I was to choose March 2011, you will see that this table is filtered with March 2011. Now, that just filters the table. What I want to do is to take that filtered table and use it to filter my fact internet sales table. To do this, what I've done is I've added a new column onto this table using this formula here. This was something I stole from an Excel MVP called Charlie Kidd. And the interesting thing about this formula is that it will return 1 for all of the rows in the table that are visible and 0 for all of the other rows. And this means that when I load the table into Power Query, I can filter on this column and see which rows in the table have actually been selected. And then, since I know which rows have been selected, I can use that to filter my main table. The last thing is, how did I get this run button to work? Well, this is good old VBA. I have a VBA macro here called run PQ query. There's the code. You've always been able to run Power Query queries indirectly in VBA by refreshing the tables that they're linked to. What's new since the beginning of this year is that you can now actually run VBA, you can run Power Query queries directly through VBA, and that's what I'm doing here. So all of this means I can now just make my selections, click a button, and my report in Excel just works. So to be honest, I think this is great, and for a lot of people, this is all of the business intelligence they ever want. They just want to be able to enter some parameters, click a button, and then get a table of data in Excel. A lot of people that I see using Power BI simply just want to use a Power BI report and do the same thing and export to Excel. If what you want is a table on an Excel workbook, don't use Power BI, just use Power Query in Excel and do something like this. Now, this has been on Windows Excel. I can do something very similar in Excel on the Mac. Power Query is being developed and improved for Excel on the Mac all of the time. The problem at the moment is that it only has limited data sources. But the demo I've just shown would actually work, I think, in Excel on the Mac, because that Excel Power Query for the Mac does support SQL Server, ODBC, text files, and getting data from the current workbook. The problem, though, is that this won't work in the browser, and it probably never will. Power Query in the browser is being improved all of the time. So at some point, I hope in the future, we would be able to connect to SQL Server databases and so on. At the moment, the only data sources supported in Power Query and Excel Online are getting data from the current workbook and anonymous OData sources. The real problem with doing this demo in Power Query Online is the fact that it would only ever work for a single person. If, for example, I was clicking a button and loading data into Excel with Power Query in Excel Online, and then somebody else opened up the same Excel workbook and changed the parameters and clicked the button, I would see their changes. It's not a true multi-user experience. Now, moving on, everything we've seen so far has been just getting a simple table of data into Excel. What happens if we want to be able to do something more complex and have a different layout? Well, we have a table of data. We could use VLOOKUP or XLOOKUP to extract the data from the tables and build a more complex layout. But there is something else we can do, something else which is new or maybe not quite so well known. We can use linked data types. Those of you who've used Excel connected to Power BI will know about linked data types, but you can also create and use linked data types in Power Query in Excel. So let's see an example of this. Here is a slightly different report, and I can choose a different sales order number. And if I choose a different sales order number, you can see the customer name, occupation, product name, color, sales amount, unit price, and tax amount all change. And we have a layout which is not a table. How have I done this? So what we can do is, well, this particular layout is driven from this Power Query query, which returns a table. Now, this is very similar to the demo that I did before. Up until the final step. So here we have a table connected to Facts Internet Sales Table and AdventureWorks with some more information from some other dimension tables as well. I've created a single column that contains just the combined sales order number and sales order line numbers. Where is it? Here we go here. So this is a unique identifier for each row here. And then the last thing that I've done is used this button, Create Data Type, which only exists in Excel in Power Query. And what this does is allow me to take all of the columns in that table and compress it all into just one column. And this one column contains Excel data types. So I'm loading this, under this sheet here. And, you know, it's parameterized. I can change the date in the way that I did before. And now, because I've got a table with Excel data types in, I can use data validation to put a drop-down box here to get just a single sales order number and sales order line number. And now I've got a cell here that contains an Excel data type. I can choose, let's say we choose this cell, which contains the occupation. I can write a formula like this and say, give me the English occupation associated with this cell D4. And I can get these property values out. Like I can get the product color, or the sales amount, or the unit price, or indeed take the first name and the last name and use a formula to combine them into a single piece of text. Now, again, this is great, but it's a single user thing. What happens if we want to be able to run these reports on a schedule and maybe email them out? This is where Power Automate comes in. So I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with Power Automate on the web. This is part of the Power Platform. It's very, very widely used. But there's another interesting part of Power Automate which allows you to automate tasks on the desktop. So this is something called Power Automate Desktop, and this allows you to do something called robotic process automation, which sounds complicated, but it isn't. It just allows you to record actions on your desktop and replay them. So what we want to do here is to be able to say, well, let's take that Power Query report that we built earlier, and let's just automatically change the parameters and rerun the report, save the report somewhere, maybe email it out, and then move on to the next parameter value that we want to use. How do we do this? Well, here is Power Automate Desktop, and let's edit this desktop flow. I'm not an expert in Power Automate Desktop, but it took me about half an hour to get this working. And I think Power Automate Desktop is actually really interesting and really powerful. I'm not going to run this Power Automate Desktop flow because it takes quite a long time, but I will talk through what it does. So first of all, let me open up an Excel workbook in the background. We'll go back to here. Right. It's quite easy to read. What happens when I run this desktop flow is, first of all, it launches Excel with a particular workbook open. And the workbook that it has open is this one, which only contains one worksheet, and this worksheet contains just 3 dates. 3 dates that I could plug in to the Power Query queries that I was showing earlier, the simple tabular report demo. It opens this workbook, and then it reads those 3 dates and stores them into a variable, and then it closes the workbook. So we don't need this anymore. What it then does is it opens up Excel again, but this time with a different file, template report XLSM. What this does is basically the same thing that I do here. So this is not the template file, but it's exactly the same query. It has a cell where you can enter a date and a Power Query query, which gets the sales order numbers for that date. And it opens Excel with that file. It loops through every single date that we read from the first Excel workbook. It pastes the current date into cell C2. And then it runs a macro. So as I said, you can now run a Power Query query from a macro. So this runs the macro. It waits 10 seconds to make sure the macro completes. And then it saves current Excel workbook with a special name containing the date that we just run the Power Query query for. And then after that, it closes Excel and loops back around to the next date. And the end result is that you have 3 Excel workbooks or 3 different dates where the Power Query query has been run for that date and contains the sales order numbers for that date. You can run this on a schedule, and then in combination with Power Automate on the web, you could save this to a file share or maybe email these workbooks out to different people. So you can't do this in pure Excel, but with Power Automate and Power Automate Desktop, you can automatically generate a large number of Excel reports. Moving on to the next type of BI that we can do. Well, instead of just tables, sometimes you just want to explore your data. You want to find out what's there. You don't know the question, but you just want to look around. And everybody knows that pivot tables are the best way to do this. Now, pivot tables have been in Excel for a long time, and Power Pivot has been in Excel for a long time, I think since the year 2007, which is now 15 years ago. So there's probably not anything much interesting and new to mention here. If I go to my Power Pivot demo, what I've done is taken all of the data from that factored net sales table in AdventureWorks, and instead of parameterizing it and only loading a chunk of it, I've loaded all of the data from that entire table into the Excel data model, into Power Pivot, built a pivot table, and I can now slice and dice with slices. And it'll take a little bit of time to wake up. And I've got a filter up at the top for product color, and of course I can change the field area down here. So I think everybody that's done any kind of data analysis in Excel will be very familiar with pivot tables. There's not really very much interesting to say here. What is interesting and what is fairly new though is that if you've got an Excel workbook that uses Power Pivot, you can also open it in Excel Online. Let's open that exact same Excel workbook in Excel Online in the browser. And this is the same file that I was showing just a moment ago. Again, it takes a little bit of time when I'm sharing my screen, but I can change slicer values. The first one is always slow. There we go. Change the slicer. I can change the filters. I can even change the layout. So we could take a month away from here and perhaps put product name on rows instead. So you're no longer limited to using Power Pivot on the desktop. You can share your Power Pivot workbooks and people can use them and interact with them in the browser. Again, some drawbacks. Unfortunately, the Excel data model and Power Pivot will never work for Excel on the Mac. I think it's going to be too difficult for us to ever port Power Pivot to Excel on the Mac. But the good news is that, pardon me, if you've got access to Excel in the browser, even if you're a Mac user, you'll now still be able to get a lot of value from Power Pivot. When I first wrote these slides, I had to just hint at some new work that was being done here, but this was announced, I think, last Tuesday, that we've effectively upgraded the version of the analysis services engine inside the latest versions of Excel, which mean you can now use a lot more new DAX functions inside Power Pivot. And we're going to be investing in Power Pivot in Excel a lot. It's something that hasn't had much love in the last couple of years. There are going to be a lot of cool new things happening in this area. Now, exploratory analysis is not just pivot tables, though. Sometimes you just want to grab some data and play around with it, not necessarily using a pivot table. So let's have a look at some other cool things that have happened recently in Excel. Obviously, since I work at Microsoft, I am very interested in the Microsoft stock price. And it's not doing really very well this year. It's gone down a lot. Now, this web page has got listings for the Microsoft stock price for the last couple of days. If I was doing a Power Query demo, I might try and show how you can copy the data from this page into Power Query. But the interesting thing is, and this is very true of stock price data, a lot of web pages are designed specifically to make it difficult to scrape data. So it might be that I could connect to this page in Power Query, but it's been designed in a way to make it particularly difficult for anybody to grab the data from this page. So how can I get this data from this page into Excel? Well, let me just open up a new Excel file. And let's do this. So what I can do is take a screenshot of this table. I'm going to use good old Windows snipping tool. I'm going to take a new screenshot. And let's just, come on. PC is running very slow today. My PC is as ill as I am. Looks like it's going to work.
Chris, do you want me to capture this and send this through the chat window?
It's all right. If it's not going to work, I'll just move on quickly. Here we go. It's almost going to work. Almost worked then. Come on, come on. Right, maybe it would be a good idea, Aki, if you could take a screenshot. Ah, here we go.
Yeah,
It's worked.
yeah,
All right,
yeah.
I've got it. I've got it. All right, so let's take a screenshot of this table. Maybe that didn't. All right, still thinking about it. There's the table. And let's just copy it to the clipboard. And then if I go over to Excel here and go to data, there's this new option from picture. And I can load in a file on my PC, or I can get something from the clipboard. So let's do this. Pardon me. So what Excel is doing is it's trying to find the table in the picture that I've given it. There we go. And it has tried to read the numbers and the text. It's done okay in some cases, so I will accept that. That's read correctly. Here, that should be low, not LOI. And then here, this should be close, not CPOS. Should be ADJ, adjusted close. But I think all of the other numbers look okay. So I can insert the data. And there is my table of data copied from a picture on the clipboard. Let's turn this into an Excel table. That. And what we can also do here is if I go to Home, I've got this Analyze Data button, which allows me to automatically analyze data. And I can insert charts. Let's say maybe insert the chart. There we go. So it's automatically drawn a chart for me. I can even type in a question. So let's say show date where open is greater than 240, and it will even create a pivot table for me, or a pivot chart, automatically filtered to the dates where open was greater than 240. So that's pretty cool as well. Last thing to show in the last 5 minutes are interactive reports and dashboards. So pivot tables, interactive analysis, that's a solo thing. That's something you might do on your own. But of course, what you want to be able to do, and what people love with Power BI, is to create interactive reports which they can share with a large number of people. This is where Excel and Excel Online really come in. So you can build on the functionality that I showed earlier. You can also use some of the other functionality that has been available in Excel for a long time, such as cube formulas in combination with Excel. And you can build a rather cool looking Excel interactive report. Again, I have no artistic skill, so I'm sure you'd be able to build something a lot more beautiful than the Excel report that I've got here. But Here we go. Here is a report page built on top of pivot tables and pivot charts. So I can change the occupation. And what I've done here is connected the slicers to both the pivot table and the pivot chart, something which is possible. So I change the slicer that changes the pivot table and the pivot chart. And I can also use Excel cube formulas to create more complex layouts. So I would say, yes, this is almost an interactive dashboard, but there is something else. There's one last problem we need to solve. Like I said, an Excel report, an Excel workbook in the browser is still an Excel workbook in the browser. And if somebody else was to come in here and open up the same Excel file, like this, any changes they made would be changes that I would see as well. So let's see this in action. What does this really mean? Let's pretend that I'm Aki. He's come in and he's opened up this Excel file. And he's looking at 2012, and then he chooses the year 2013 in this slicer. The data changes to look at 2013. We go back to Excel here. Well, I'm looking at this data, this Excel file, and hey, it's just changed to 2013. And I say, no, I want to look at 2012. So do this. There we go. Change to 2012. And the data will go back to 2012. And then guess what? Aki's view has changed back to 2012 because we're both editing the same Excel workbook. Now, this may be good for collaboration, but this is not good for interactive reports. I don't want the changes I make in a slicer to affect what other people viewing the same Excel workbook get to see. But there is a way to solve this. What you have to do is go to File, Share, and Embed. And then you can choose how much interaction is allowed. We're going to say, let people sort and filter. And then we can grab this embed code down here. Now, if I actually just show here, here's the embed code. And inside here, inside this iframe, is actually a URL. Now, this URL contains a special parameter called display the workbook in embed view. And if I copy this and I share this with other people, it opens up the Excel workbook in a way that stops other people seeing the changes that I've made, or at least the selections that I've made. So I can change a slicer, but that slicer change is not seen by anybody else. It also turns off grid lines. It makes everything look a little bit more respectable. And now when I change a slicer, nobody else also viewing the same report sees that slicer change either. So this for me is really important for turning Excel and Power Pivot into a real interactive reporting dashboarding solution. Downsides, doesn't work on mobile devices, iOS or Android yet, but maybe it will in the future. Right, that's the end of what I wanted to show. Let's come to some conclusions. Honestly, Excel is always the #1 data analysis and reporting tool. It's used by way more people than anybody else. And as you've seen, a lot of cool new things have happened in the last couple of years. It's still not perfect. It doesn't work well or so well on the Mac or mobile. And you still need extra tools like Power Automate in order to do any form of automation. And I would say overall, you probably still want to use Power BI if you want to be able to do properly cool, nice, interactive reports. But Excel has changed. Excel has got a lot of new functionality recently. And I would say that depending on what type of BI you want to be able to do, Power BI, Excel is still a really great choice for doing BI and analytics. Thank you. So, are there any questions?
Hi, thank you so much, Chris. Great demos, great presentation. Although you were coughing, I hope you get well soon.
Thank you.
Yeah. So we have a few questions. Actually, I have a couple questions, but one of the questions from one of our MVPs is you can read from the chat window as well. So he says in Japan, we probably see a bit of a trend toward using BI-like data exploration in Excel, such as Power Query and Power Pivot, which we call modern Excel. So is there a movement in the UK and other countries to increase the number of people using the advanced exploration you introduced this time?
Yes, but again, I think it's probably the same as in Japan. There are some people who really love Excel and really take the time to see all of the new features, but most people who use Excel don't really know what it can do, and they don't know about all these cool new things. So we have to go out there and tell everybody about them.
Yeah, exactly. So that leads to my question, which is pretty simple. How should Excel and Power BI be used together?
That's a different question. That's not something that I talked about in this presentation.
Yeah.
But of course, with Power BI and Excel together, you can use Analyze in Excel, and you can have pivot tables and cube formulas and even linked data types in Excel that are connected up to data stored in a Power BI data set.
Yeah. And the potential is huge. I mean,
exactly.
Yeah.
And that also all works in the browser as well.
Right.
So if you wanted to build an Excel report in the browser connected to data in Power BI, you can do that.
Great. 他に誰か、皆さん質問がある方いらっしゃいますでしょうか。もう非常に貴重な回だと思いますので、ぜひチャットウィンドウの方に貼っていただければと思います。So is there anyone else who has any questions? This is now and never opportunity that you can ask for Chris, who, are very, it's nice to have him here today. If not, I'm going to ask the final question. So Chris, any message for Power BI and the Excel BI users in Japan? Your message?
My message.
Yeah.
Just go and have fun.
Yeah.
Have fun. I always have fun using all this functionality. Actually, it's my job, but I love it anyway. So just enjoy it I hope you enjoy it as much as I do.
Thank you. And when is it that we can meet you in person here in Japan?
As soon as I get the travel budget to come over to visit you in Japan.
Okay, thank you.
Maybe next year.
Yeah. That's what GynaCube, those folks also mentioned. So thank you very much.
Cool. All right. Thanks a lot then.
Time's
Bye-bye.
up. Thank you. See you.